Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chinmay Shalya. I work for International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, iForest. We are starting our panel discussions today with an extremely distinguished international panel, which brings for us the global experience on just transition, the learnings for the developing economies of the Global South, their unique challenges and opportunities. It's my privilege to introduce and call upon the stage in alphabetical order Mr. Brian Madave. Mr. Madave is the head of energy efficiency at the International Energy Agency. Mr. Edwin Kukuk. Mr. Kukuk is the first Counselor, Energy and Climate Action, European Union Delegation to India. Ms. Louis Nodia. Ms. Nodia is the Commissioner, Presidential Climate Commission, South Africa. Mr. Neethi Nesadurai. Mr. Nesadurai is the Director and Regional Coordinator for Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia. Dr. Venkatachalam Anbumuri. Dr. Anbumuri is the Director of Research, Strategy and Innovation at the Economic Research Institute for Association of South Asian Nations and East Asia, Indonesia. I now invite our moderator for the panel, Dr. Shrestha Banerjee, who is the Director of Just Transition at iForest. Dr. Banerjee will be taking the discussion forward. So over to you.
Thank you everyone for joining in, and I have been coordinating with many of you, and I can't be thankful enough for all of you making your time. Actually, this panel shows that really people have traveled to join us, and thank you all once again. This panel is actually a very diverse panel and global in many sense, because we have representation from the European Union, IEA, which represents actually work around many countries, but is in Europe, but also has to do a lot of, we'll discuss on US issues with them. And we have all the Global South countries which have been in the hot seat of the Just Energy Transition partnerships that has been evolving over the last 1.5 years. In that light, I would just say that why we have the international panel and why it is important for G20. The international deliberation on just transition has primarily evolved under the UNFCCC framework, starting with the Paris Agreement in 2015. Then we had the Silesia Declaration in 2018. A Just Transition Declaration was signed at the Glasgow COP in last year, 2021. And finally, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we had the first work program on just transition, which was launched, which is now going to take shape in the coming years. But just transition is more than about climate talks. It is about economic and social development. Therefore, there has been talk on the economic and development forums around it, and G20 constitutes that backdrop. Now, in G20, energy transition has evolved through the interministerial talks, the dialogues, and the ministerial meetings that we see. We also have leaders' declaration where energy transition got mentioned again and again. But in the last 2 G20 presidencies, particularly starting with Italy and then last year in Indonesia, the issue of energy transition along with just transition has got heightened focus. And from that point of view, we start the conversation on just transition on this backdrop when India has taken the leadership of the G20 presidency. So I'll start now with the panel discussion. The way we will hold it, we'll have rounds of questions, which I will be moderating with all of our esteemed panelists. We'll have 10 minutes. We'll try to keep it to 10 minutes of Q&A. And I request all questions and answers to be targeted towards the structure of this panel, the focus of this panel, and the focus of this dialogue, and taking into account the panelists we have on the dais today. Because we have many more questions where we'll be able to ask questions which are more relevant to the speakers who we have throughout the day. Thank you. So I'll start the question in a way that maybe I'll start with a focus on the Global South, moving on to the European Union, and then Brian, moving on to you as the IEA being an agency which is working across border and across countries. In fact, I'll start first because Louis spoke in the morning, I had the first questions for you, but maybe I'll start with Anbu. I called, so Anbu Mozi, Mr. Anbu Mozi, I am typically referred to him as Anbu. And thank you for joining us today. The question we have for you is that Indonesia, in the last year, at the end of last year, has entered into the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But from South Africa, what we have been looking at, like when South Africa deal was signed earlier around the Glasgow COP, everyone was very happy about it. But what it unfolded was the money was not enough, and it was going into only very specific issues. So how do you see now that the Indonesia deal has been signed, which also again has been signed without a plan being in place? Now it will be developed. So is it just to actually, is it just to just provide some support to the ailing PLN, the energy infrastructure in the country, bailout, in fact, I would say the word, or is it actually going to focus on just transition? Because the Indonesian deal is also about 20 billion. And you think, how do you see this evolving right now?
Thank you, Srastha. And it is a very complex dilemma that is where Indonesia is in. And when we mentioned about that JETP, and that was signed during the Bali G20 meeting, and US and Japan has come forward with the 20 billion. We know this is very small, but still it could be a kind of a catalytic funding for phasing out this coal-based power plant and in the long term, for example, 2050 or 2060, there is a time frame where Indonesia is thinking about. And but this JTB, I think probably we can learn from South Africa and what could be the starting point. And here, if you're coming to this Indonesia, like I think you have a very good report, Dr. Chandrabhushan mentioned about it, what could be the blueprint for phasing out. And the complexity is in Indonesia is not only the system barriers for the coal power plant, but also on the other side, once we phased out, what will happen? And this renewable energy need to be scaled up. And we have the potential about 50%. And we have the potential to be achieved, and what type of barriers that is we have. So this JTP not only focusing on this coal power, but also it need to address the system barriers. Then only it becomes more relevant and pragmatic. There is one part of the question. And but the second part is the PLN, whether JTP is designed to support PLN. PLN is a kind of a very unique entity, and it exists. It is a state-owned company which has the monopoly in both in the production and the distribution. But there is a constitution in Indonesia that was created in 1948 that basically kind of a legal right to operate in the welfare of these communities. So PLN is now losing money, becoming more basically debt driven, but at the same time it is also increasing its efficiency, and there is a top management changes. This is a kind of a same dilemma of any state-owned company. Either you need to focus on increasing your business profit, at the same time so you need to protect your community, the social obligations you have. I think this is where the dilemma comes in for the government, either to support it or becoming an independent. And PLN has the kind of a plan to increase the efficiency and also moving to the gas, as well as integrating the renewables into these systems. So my point here is this JTP is not a kind of a single or a silver bullet for your transition or the decarbonization. but it is one of the tools to resolve the puzzle.
Thank you, Anbu. My next question, in fact, then I'll take to Louis, as we are, the first experience in South Africa has been largely around ESCOM, which is again in the similar shape, a little bit like PLN. Yeah. So, but the thing is right now that the money that has come in the first go, which is largely in form of loans. There is concessional loans, but it's largely loans, 95% of it. Now, the concern right now is that the kind of transitional issues we are looking at, such as economic diversification, workforce support, social welfare, it requires a lot of development financing. Now, how do you see that this kind of support that is coming through the JETPs, will it going to help? And right now, South Africa has put the target is the money at least foreseen for the next 5 years is about 100 billion. So how do you see this being leveraged right now? Is JETPs enough, or how the next set of negotiations should go in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the money is coming in a mixture of loans and grants. We have argued very strongly that the grant component should be much higher because the justice dimension of an energy transition, a lot of those aspects that you have to fund, they are not activities that return you money, that return you an interest. And therefore, it requires grant funding for that, for the justice dimensions. We're happy to accept highly concessional loans, and we will, of course, try to demand that they be as concessional as possible. We've been having a series, the Commission has organized a series of consultations on the current JET IP, because what South Africa did was, we went asking for money because, as you were saying, our fiscus is under tremendous pressure, our state utility is mired in debt and therefore unable to go to renewables. We went asking for money, and we do thank the international partners that stepped forward to give it to us. And so, what they are offering is the grants and the concessional loans. So we didn't expect to only get grants, but those loans must be highly concessional. And we are, I have raised a question as to whether those loans could not be rand denominated rather than dollar and euro denominated, so that we are not held hostage by the vagaries of the exchange rate. I am not a finance person. I don't know if this is even possible, but there is enormous concern from labor and civil society organizations in South Africa that we lock our country and our taxpayers into onerous repayments down the line. So we really have to watch that very carefully. The other thing that we can do is domestically, there are sources of funds that should be looked into, and perhaps it's relevant for other countries as well. We have, at the same time as we're needing money to transition low carbon, we are still giving subsidies to the fossil fuel sector in a range of ways. So the Commission is going to dig into exactly what are those subsidies, what is the quantum of them, and how can we reverse those. Yeah, so
Thank you.
I want to say one thing about these deals that are now starting to happen with various emerging and developing countries, is that they sidestep the UNFCCC regime. So what you're having is developed countries are selecting those countries which are very strategic for them to transition, and through the lever of money, assisting them to make that transition. we've all got to transition. I don't question that at all. In fact, I'm a bit concerned when the transition looks to be too slow. So yes, we need the money to transition, and we need to transition sooner rather than later. But I'm just flagging the fact that instead of the money flowing into the UNFCCC financial instruments and funds, it's now bilateral deals handpicked by the funder. So, which may not lead to equitable disbursement to all countries which need it.
Thanks. Thank you, Louis. I think it just leads to the question that we were thinking of asking to Nithi. Not specifically to Vietnam, we would really want you to briefly comment on that, the latest JETP deal that Vietnam soon after entered into after Indonesia. What are the key issues that you think that Vietnam is going to address? But more importantly, Nithi, because you are working across ASEAN countries, the oil and gas sector has a larger share of energy consumption in many of these countries. So going ahead, just the deals or just the negotiations, funding being so coal focused, how does it address the larger goal of climate action and energy transition that we are talking about? And what Mr. Chandrabhushan, in fact, mentioned in the morning, that for India, we aspire to have a framework that is not just coal focused, but we simultaneously look into all of these and, and just take the opportunity, where is it to transition? So if you can comment on that briefly.
Well, two very big questions. With regard to why only coal, I'll go back to what Louis mentioned just now, which is that, the G7 countries have cherry-picked some countries to work with to pursue their agenda, which is basically accelerating coal transition. Of course, for Climate Action Network, it has to be transition from all fossil fuels. In fact, our strategy document developed in 2019 specifies very clearly ending fossil fuels. So it's not specifically restricted to coal. And I also want to clarify here that, from my context, when you talk about just transition, the central focus is on justice. Broken down into three elements: procedural justice, a socially inclusive process. Who gets a seat at the table? Who are we being inclusive? Are all voices being heard? Distributive justice, who gets what at the end of the process? Are we perpetuating the same inequalities and injustices that perpetuated before? Are we being fair and just in the new system? And the third is the restorative justice, addressing historical injustice as well. So when I use the word just transition, I'm coming from that concept of justice. Now, just talking about Vietnam, it's of the three just energy transition partnership deals which have been signed and sealed, two of them are in Southeast Asia. So the first, of course, was Indonesia, and then more recently Vietnam. And when you look at Indonesia and Vietnam, they are two of the three largest coal-consuming countries in Southeast Asia. So Philippines is the third one, and it's likely at some point there'll be a JETP for Philippines as well. We expected the deal with Vietnam to have been signed earlier, and there were some reasons, why they didn't sign it earlier, and I think some of these points also were quite important. One was, first, I think they were offered $5 billion, and then they were upset that if South Africa is getting 8.5, why should we only get 5? And of course, Vietnam, and then the second thing was they were arguing over what's the balance between loans and grants. This was the point, you raised, Louis. Now, there was also, and this is a point which came up in the first plenary session, there was also a lack of a united position among ministries in Vietnam. Quite obviously, ministries have different priorities. And a lack of a united position among ministries and the Vietnam government regarding the JETP. And also on the G7 side, there was an issue concerning the arrest of prominent environmental leaders in Vietnam. my own board chair is currently been imprisoned for 2 years on supposedly tax evasion charges, when we know it's probably not, or not. So that wasn't sufficient of a red line. We were pushing the governments to make that a red line, and the G7 countries were happy to go ahead and give the money anyway. Now, in terms of what concessions Vietnam prepared to make, they are agreeable to phasing down of coal if enough international investment is received for renewable energy. They know about climate change. They know the country is severely affected by it. It's one of the most vulnerable countries to climate risk. Yet they understand the urgency of energy transition, yet they lack finances, capacities, the right grid structure and framework policies to address climate change in a holistic manner. And there's hardly, the other interesting thing is when the JETP was signed, there was a lot of press coverage in the G7 countries. There was almost silence in Vietnam. There was hardly any publicity whatsoever. And there wasn't even a physical signing of the document. There was just a release of the agreement, and there was the presence of someone from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment and someone from the Foreign Ministry. That was it, very low key. So, and again, I think this is a very important point. Just transition means very different things. And for government, just transition and what civil society talk about just transition are polar opposites sometimes. Yeah. So, for instance, for the Vietnam government is that when we have just transition and a transition from coal to renewables or even fossil fuels to renewable, where just transition comes in is that the price of electricity, that is the tariff, must remain affordable. Full stop. Of course, we have a much broader vision, as I just said. So in terms of risks associated with this deal, civil society and public were in the dark. They still remain in the dark. Discussions on implementing the clean energy shift are needed at federal, provincial, and local government levels to work on how the green energy policies can be a win-win for all, including affected communities. And there's no sign that this is happening. So anyway, I'll stop here. I could go on. So I'll just take a pause here.
No, we'll come back. We'll come back to many things. Edwin, so there, actually, I'll take you to more question on subnational than the national here. Because in the morning we saw the map, and the discussion was that the unfolding of actually what just transition has to do is going to be at the subnational level. We need plans at the subnational level, regions and all that. And the map clearly shows that Europe is at the forefront right now, European countries, EU member states, because the just transition funding mechanism has been developed in 2021, which is now asking that if territories, the coal regions particularly, develop this territorial just transition plans, then funding will be released contingent on that. Now, how do you see? I mean, we have reviewed certain plans, but actually these also are very evolving right now. So what is the current stage of implementation? Is there any difference that is this making? What are the challenges that are emerging in terms of implementing this plan? If you can briefly, I know this is a big question, but your brief comments.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. If you allow me first, a few words on the European Green Deal, because it's also linked to what has been said in the earlier discussions, and also on the fact that as EU, we are very keen on meeting our financial obligations, and we think we are paying our part of the 100 billion, and we are also urging other developing countries to do so. We are also very keen on supporting the different processes on the just energy transition partnerships. We were heavily involved in Vietnam, and we supported the one in South Africa and Indonesia, and we would also support, although others are in the lead, a partnership with India. As regards the European Green Deal, so what we are trying to do in the EU is exactly what was discussed earlier, is to have economic growth. We call it an economic growth strategy, but at the same time to get rid of environmental impacts. Actually, we believe that focusing on a green economy it is the future, and it is how we can economically grow. And we are trying to do this not only in the energy sector, but we try to do this in a holistic way and to look at all sectors. So we look at industry, agriculture, mobility, nature, the financial sector, research and innovation sector. So what is needed in all those sectors to have this economic growth without having the environmental impacts? We also realize that if you have this green transition, we realize that there will be many parts of society, many sectors that will profit, but there are also population, region, sectors that will actually be at risk if you push this green agenda. And that's why in all our communication, we always talk about the green transitions, but we need to avoid that we leave people behind, so leave no one behind. And that's why an important part of the European Green Deal is indeed the Just Transition Mechanism, which consists of several elements. The one that you mentioned is the Just Transition Fund. So all these several elements together, they should mobilize up to 60 billion euros in the period 2021 to 2027. And the Just Transition Fund itself, it's supposed to invest in jobs creation, in skill development, in investments in greener SMEs, in rehabilitation of former mining sites, in research and innovation, and also in some cases in transforming a carbon-intensive industry and less carbon-intensive industry if the CO2 emissions reductions are really significant and if it's important for job protection. To have access to this fund, member states need to make, and you already mentioned it, territorial just transition plans up to 2030. And my answer to your question will be a little bit disappointing because I understand that only this December all of the territorial just transition plans have been adopted, except one, I think. And now we are in the process of implementing. So I've asked Brussels what are the experiences, and they said it's a little bit too early. So I understood from Dr. Bashan that you want to do this on a yearly basis. So we would be very happy to report back at a later event. So I also want to mention that the Just Transition Fund is one of the elements. There's also the Invest EU Just Transition Scheme, which focuses on the private sector. And there is a EIB, public sector loan facility, which focuses, and I think that's also very important, on those projects where normally not enough own resources would be mobilized. So and then the EIB is doing that. I think I'm taking too much time, so back to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Edwin, that you promised to come back next year when we do this dialogue. Brian, now turning to you, I'll allude a little bit to the IA's role in the Just Energy Transition from a Global South perspective. The IA has played an important role in the Indonesian deal that we have been talking about. But there is also a fear that, this shutting down of old power plants and transition of workers, it is leaving out a lot of discussion around the workers and the communities. So how do you think, as an agency, that you can ensure that just transitions are happening in a more inclusive manner? This agreements are being signed with a focus on the workers and communities and to pay for that.
Thank you, Shrestha. And again, thanks to you and your colleagues for inviting me here, but also congratulations on the excellent reports you've launched today. And thank you for your question. So in the IEA, we use the term people-centered clean energy transitions, and we define it as encompassing 4 dimensions. The first is worker protection and creation of decent jobs. The second is aligning clean energy policies with positive social and economic development. The third is protection, but also enhancement of social inclusion and equality. And the fourth is viewing people as active participants in clean energy transitions in all of that entails. And we use the word people first because we want to remind governments and all involved that clean energy transitions are not an abstract thing that we're doing for the sake of them. They're for people and they're about people. They're about making people's lives better by mitigating the worst effects of climate change, but also creating new jobs in a green economy, improving people's access to energy, making energy more affordable, bringing the good things that energy brings to life, but also addressing questions like local air pollution and the many other dimensions of the energy question. And so we do see it in that round, and it is true, you're right, that sometimes when we, particularly the word just transition, we tend to think about it that it's just about jobs, and it's often focused on just about people losing their jobs. And it's right that we prioritize conversations on those people. I mean, our analysis shows that clean energy transitions around the world will create many millions more jobs than will be lost in the transitions. But that's not of comfort to particular workers or communities who feel we're coal-based or we're oil-based or whatever else it is, and we feel that we're going to lose our livelihoods and maybe there won't be something for us in this new economy. So it's right that countries are focusing on these questions in a broad sense and thinking about it strategically. One of our, well, I guess we have two key roles. One is analytical. We can bring numbers to bear on this. You know, where will the jobs be? What kind of skills and opportunities are there? And in the case of Indonesia, for example, our net zero roadmap for Indonesia has become the basis of the JETP conversation, because it sets out Indonesia's opportunity to phase out fossil fuels and move towards new opportunities related to the clean energy, but also sectors like critical minerals, where Indonesia has some very interesting resources. And the second role for us is about helping people learn from each other. And here I am in Delhi, and tomorrow somebody could be having this conversation in Washington, D.C., and the next day in Jakarta, and the next day in Hanoi. Many countries are facing exactly the same questions and challenges right now. So there's huge opportunities to learn from each other. And I think that's why it's really great we're having this international dialogue where we see what different countries are trying in terms of the policy mixes, the interventions, and we can help people learn from the best of those so that the next round of policy making is even better than the first. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So, I'll just turn the question a little bit now, my order of discussions, because where Brian left, and that will be both Edwin and Brian can address that. Just transition discussions are also being shaped by global geopolitics. We looked up to what Global North has been doing, and then there is expectations that other countries will do, and there are many good examples that have come out. But also the recent developments that are happening, particularly with respect to Ukraine war, which is having an impact on how Germany or Poland is reacting to that, opening up some of the old coal mines, power plants to ensure energy security. For the US, we have the very recent announcement on the Alaskan oil and gas fields being opened up. And this is going to have some implication for the global north, as we presume, because there are bigger concerns of energy security that we are dealing with, and also the development aspirations that these countries have. I would like to have your reactions, maybe, Edwin, first on the recent geopolitics that is having, but more on your observation that how do you think it will impact the just transition momentum that is underway in other countries, and particularly the global south?
Okay, thank you very much for this very important question. The decline of coal-based energy production, which is indeed in Europe, when we talk about just energy transition, the coal sector is a very important one for us. So this decline is an ongoing reality in Europe. Anyhow, so we see indeed that in the last year there have been some increase in coal use and coal power plants. Coal power plants having being reopened, but we consider this something temporary. And in Europe, there's no discussion anywhere on looking again at our commitments for 2030 and at looking at our climate neutrality goal for 2050. On the contrary, our answer to the Russian invasion in Ukraine was the Repower EU proposal, which meant that we want to become independent from gas from Russia through energy savings. And actually, the energy savings have been very significant during the last winter for several reasons. This Repower EU proposal also aims at accelerating our increase in renewable energy, solar energy, and offshore wind, and also green hydrogen. And also, and this was also something that has been discussed before, the Repower EU also looks more closely to how to diversify our global supply chain. So the answer is there might be a temporary effect, and because of the war in Ukraine, and actually there also have been some other reasons for a small increase in coal use, which was the drought in Europe, which caused problems for hydropower and also nuclear power. But we see actually already that the coal use that was envisaged is actually not used, and we see the coal use going down already now in Europe. That's what I understood. So the short answer is we are only accelerating, and it's making our commitments firmer, and I think it has no impact on our just transition initiatives in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So your comments, I mean, I do not expect you to speak on behalf of the US administration, but more on the optics of the decisions or the unfoldings of some of the events that are ongoing in the global north. What are your observations on the optics of it for the just transition momentum that is underway in the global south and many other countries?
I guess we've been living through an unprecedented global energy crisis that it has a kind of a scope and scale that we've never really witnessed before, and it's affected all parts of the world in different ways. And it has tested governments in a couple of ways that I think are worth noting here. It's, first of all, with a renewed focus on short-term energy security and prices and affordability, entirely justified and necessitated by the crisis. Governments have had their resolve tested on their net zero commitments to a certain degree. In my view, they've largely passed that test. I don't see a lot of governments in any part of the world stepping back from their net zero resolve in the last year. And in fact, our tracking of global emissions show that in 2022, global emissions did go up a little bit by way of recovery from 21, but they would have gone up 3 times larger were it not for the continued progress on clean energy, renewables and efficiency in particular. So some decisions have changed, some priorities have changed, but we see ongoing resolve that so far seems to be holding. The second way governments have been tested is in their sense of solidarity. And this, of course, has been challenging. There's been, competition for resources. There's been pressure to make unilateral decisions. Governments have been under pressure to protect citizens who've been suffering very much from high prices or less availability. We've seen global energy access fall for the first time in decades. So there are many social pressures caused by this crisis that need resolution. And that brings me to a point about optics, because I think it is fair to say that we've seen that governments do have to balance different priorities. And it's good to be reminded that all governments do that at different times. And I must say, I commend the Indian government, and we heard from Mr. Kant earlier, to put this on the table for G20 to say, well, who is responsible for emissions, both historically and today, who will suffer most from the ravages of climate change, and they're not necessarily the same people. And I think it is right to have that debate at a geopolitical level, and we're seeing that in the G20 meetings. I'll be there next week or week after in Gandhinagar, where we'll see this debate taken forward in terms of who's responsible for emissions and who's responsible for solving the problems. But of course, we know that these are global issues, and we also know that we sometimes frame these questions in terms of the costs and the challenges. But as India has shown very clearly, among others, the clean energy revolution is a huge opportunity for countries to become leaders in technology, to create new jobs, to export both resources and technological solutions. So those countries that embrace this opportunity positively will benefit hugely. And I think India is an excellent example of that.
Thanks, Brian. I'll take the discussion a little bit away from the global geopolitics, and maybe, just transition is not just shaped by global geopolitics, but as well as national politics and national aspirations. So, Louis, one of the questions I have for you in this regard is that the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that South Africa has now put out has a lot of focus on renewable energy investments in electric vehicles, hydrogen, all of that. And Mpumalanga fares in the electricity sector investments. And if we see the total electricity sector investments, the JT cost for Mpumalanga is about 10% out of that. Now, how do you think that the new can you give us a little sense of why this is, how workers can be taken care of with this amount of focus on just energy transition, or even the 100 billion revised plan also still remains on energy infrastructure, an energy plan, and not a just transition plan? If you can comment on that a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, two of the problems with the JETP and the investment plan attached to it is, the climate transition isn't just about energy. So we actually need to move beyond JETPs to bigger picture transition issues. And the second is that our JETIP, so Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which the government itself set up a task team, our government set up a task team to deliver this investment plan, is weak on justice. So, well spotted. And I think it's partly because I think it's an illustration of what happens when you ask people with technical expertise, technocrats and business people to develop the plan. Because they bring, all their best qualities and thinking to it, but they are not at the coalface, the literal coalface, to understand the issues of workers, and they're not living in the communities that would be affected to raise those people's issues. So you really have to have everybody participating in formulating these things. So I think the people tasked to develop the investment plan also realized this, which is why they then handed over to the Presidential Commission for proper consultation. And it is through this consultation process that some of these more justice elements are coming to the fore. So if the JETIP looks a bit thin on justice at the moment, I do assure you that the next iteration, which is busy being formulated now, will be much stronger on the justice. Now, what does the justice mean in a just energy transition plan? It isn't just about coal workers. It is about, now remember, we restricted to the energy question, so that already is a limitation, but sticking with energy, if we're going to move towards this new kind of economy, we have to, I call it, there's the winding down side, the decarbonization of existing, and there's the winding up side of an economy. We have to create diversification of the economy, new kinds of economic activities, new jobs. So on the winding up side, we very much need to look at new industries, which is why there's a big piece of green hydrogen in there. And because it's kind of the new business model for one of the major companies in South Africa employing thousands of people. So we want to protect those jobs. We also will need that green hydrogen to protect our steel and cement industries and make them green. So I think, there's an economic rationale behind that piece. Then where there's a big focus on electric vehicles, because motor manufacturing is also a huge employer in South Africa, and very soon none of our market economies, our export destination countries, will want internal combustion engines anymore. So we better switch our industry to electric vehicles. And so that's a justice aspect because it's jobs, but also we are saying electrify all public transport. And in South Africa, public transport is not just the formal buses, but it's also these minibus taxis, they call, that run around, which are paratransit. They are privately owned, but they move the masses of the people. So electrify those and pass through to the users of those services the savings in costs that comes from using an electric vehicle. So there's a justice dimension there. Then a lot of the expenditure in our investment plan is going into building our grid to be able to be a grid that works well with renewable energy. And we are saying also make sure that every single household below a certain income threshold has a renewable energy system. Because what is happening in South Africa at the moment is we're having rolling blackouts because demand is at certain times, demand outstrips what our system is able to deliver, for a range of really disgusting issues, including thuggery, and we were having a conversation in the car. But so businesses are saying, no, we can't run a business where, the electricity is on and off or whatever, and they're starting to put in their own renewable energy systems. Or talk to cities to wheel electricity from another company that's generating. And middle class and higher income households are starting to get off grid and put in their own systems, which means that your state utilities revenue is shrinking, and only a state utility has the mandate to look after the poor. So how do we ensure that the poor has adequate energy access and security? And that's why we're saying a big part of the justice component of this JETP could be to make sure that poor households have their own renewable energy systems. So justice, even when you limit it only to energy, comes in many different forms, and is not just about the jobs, although the jobs is a major piece of it.
Thanks, Louis. Then maybe I'll try, I'll actually move on to Anbumose, you, because it takes us there. Energy, somehow affordable energy access and energy poverty is also an issue that Just Transition needs to address. And this is also an important issue for the G20. So today that we are having this conversation, what will be your message? Because you have been putting your observations for the G20 in earlier deliberations on energy transition, how regions can come together to have. But now if we take a step forward to have some message for the G20, what will be your 2 or 3 key messages that you would like to put forth?
I want to be ambitious and also pragmatic. And if you are looking at the G20, and my ambitious message is recoupling. That means if you look into this G20, and so far the first generation of G20 declarations are about the decoupling and how that emissions could be reduced from the economic growth. And I think here and the last year Indonesia, this year India, and then Brazil and South Africa. More these four countries can come together and see that continuity and of recoupling, and how this emission reductions could happen with its increased social harmony. That is what energy poverty or this inequality. That is why we wanted to make it. That is kind of a one bold messages. That is I wanted to send it to G20, and it is a human-centric transition. Second thing is I want to be pragmatic. G20 is a simple forum where you discuss and debate, and it doesn't have the compliance mechanism. G20 was created as a forum where the macro policy coordinations could be achievable with the countries, with the member countries, which basically share 70% of the GDP. Given that, what we can think about it? And the first thing what G20 pragmatically think about is where there is basically developing a guidelines for these investments, the future investments in the energy sector, where it is happen. Probably most of them are coming from the institutional investors or the banks, that is in the north, global north, and so they can control and they can guide their investments to be more human-centric or more support this recoupling process. And second thing is, and I think the panel also they mentioned, and what the leverage they have is this international financial institutions. These international financial institutions, the size is limited, and that is what we need is in billions, but they can offer is in only millions. But they can leverage it. For example, $1 of investment for ADB that is making is $10 could be generated from the capital markets. So that leveraging financing, I think probably they need to empower these international financial institutions through their Sherpa track or the financial minister's track. They can empower their financial institutions. So this is a kind of two pragmatic suggestions that I could able to make for the G20. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nithya, I'll move to you with a question that again stems from Louis a little bit. She mentioned that one of the limitations of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan of South Africa has been because it is being driven by technocrats and bureaucrats. Now, also in the G20, we fix it. And also we are talking of when we're developing these plans, in a more inclusive manner. And one of the focus which we don't often talk about is involving the younger generation and capturing their aspirations in the planning. But now there is a challenge, and I want to address that. Many of the young climate campaigners often ask end fossil fuel, which is very immediate. But we all understand right now that just transition is a more complex process, and we cannot rush through it. It will take time. So how do you reconcile, as an organization like CANSIA, between the demand of the youth as well as what the time that just transition will take? How do you bridge this gap?
I think, I don't see a difference, inconsistency between both. Ending fossil fuels, like I said, it's a strategy of Climate Action Network, and accompanying that is a just transition. And ending when we talk about ending fossil fuels, and we look at it globally, we have to approach it from a perspective of fair share and equity. That means the richer industrialized fossil fuel producing countries start phasing out, followed by countries in the developing world. So if you look at Southeast Asia, for instance, we have 3 oil and gas producing and exporting countries. You have Brunei, you have Malaysia, which is an oil and gas exporter, and you have Indonesia, which is one of the largest coal exporters in the world. And the economies are dependent on it. For instance, in Malaysia, maybe about 60%, of the economy is derived from revenue from our national oil corporation. So, you can't expect these countries to turn off the tap tomorrow, especially when there is so little leadership by example coming from the industrialized countries. You talked about the optics earlier. At SB 56, which is the intersessional meeting, I met with the heads of delegation of UK, Canada, and US. And we're telling them, we met Alok Sharma right after Glasgow. What did they do? Give licenses for oil drilling in the North Sea. Now they've just commissioned the opening of a coal mine. There's the Alaska project. When you are doing that, how do you expect us to go and talk to our governments about transitioning away from fossil fuels, which our economies are dependent on? For those countries which import fossil fuels, it's a strong case, like you will save a lot of revenue. So coming back to your point, irrespective of where we are, the other danger I also want to say is that as we talk about phasing away from coal, a lot of there are certain opportunists who have now said that fossil gas is now the transition fuel. And what's happening? Southeast Asia is now poised to become the new fossil gas infrastructure for the world, with all the consequences in terms of emissions that's going to lead to. So coming back to your point, we should push for ending fossil fuels. And even in Southeast Asia, 9 out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia have got net zero emissions declarations of some sort. 7 are by 2050, and then one is 2060, another one is 2065. So they've got the hooks for us to work on. While we are transitioning, while we are in the process of ending fossil fuels, let's get the infrastructure in now for just transition. So we don't have to wait till like tomorrow we are turning off the tap and we start talking about just transition. So we have to start working on the just transition institutional framework. So I like very much what Chandrabhushan presented today, because I've been working on creating, institutional frameworks for mainstreaming and implementing sustainability since 2007, and it gels very much with the approach you all have taken. We should also start creating the institutional framework now for just transition. And Southeast Asia is very much in the process of doing that. Because we need real world examples on how just transition can take place. We are about to start on implementing just energy transition in an active coal mining region in East Kalimantan, Indonesia this year. And we are also starting a scoping study for influencing just energy transition this year in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, with the aim of, after scoping study, to develop a 4-year project to create institutional frameworks for implementing just transition within all countries in Southeast Asia. So it goes hand in hand with ending fossil fuels.
Sure. And I hope the youth remains in that. But we are really tight on time. I can take 2 to 3 questions from the audience. But as I suggested, please be specific to the objective of this panel. We have many more questions we can take in the day. So yes, please. And sorry.
Thank you. So, this panel raised, the issue that there are many dimensions to just transition. And I just wanted to ask, globally and in the countries and regions that we're talking about, is there any discussion in the just transition discourse or plans with respect to the critical minerals that would be needed for energy transition? And this is relevant because South Africa, Southeast Asia have reserves of critical minerals, and there will be pressure to mine more of these to fuel energy transition, across the globe? Thank you.
Brian, you would.
I'm sure other panelists will say there's a lot of discussion of this topic. It's a really important topic for a couple of reasons. First of all, energy security is changing from our dependence on key fossil fuels to risks of dependence on key supply chains in clean energy, particularly related to critical minerals in terms of where they come from, who is processing them, but also the social and environmental impact associated with their scaling up, because a lot of critical minerals, according to our analysis anyway, we will need to expand their availability many times fold, whether it's to build EVs or batteries or wind turbines or anything else of the future. So it's really important to do this right, so we don't just kind of shift one set of environmental and social problems and one set of security problems from one domain to another. But of course, it also represents an opportunity. So for instance, in Indonesia, it could, in some years' time, be a bigger exporter of nickel than it is of coal today. And similarly, South Africa has great resources in many important critical minerals of the future. So I think for many economies, just speaking of the coal example, many economies who have significant operations and resources in coal mining are thinking about what the opportunities are in mining other resources, which in principle is a very good thing to be thinking about. But I think it's really important as well that we don't make the same mistakes of the past in terms of the political economies we build around those resources and the dependencies we create. So it's a really crucial question, and I think it's very important to raise it. Thank you.
Just Indonesia is seriously thinking about this, developing a new value chain for the critical minerals. Why it is, and as per the current phase down, the coal phase down, and we know there is about 60% of this coal has to be shut down, and it will affect 250,000 people. So we need to find an alternative economic pathways for them and the new industries. That is where our own estimate says that is, if the correct policies, if it is integrated with these industrial policies, innovation policy and the energy policies, this critical by 2040, and maybe Indonesia may be compensating for this coal export with this new value chains, but that need a kind of very different approach, and that need a more decentralized capacity for this regional governments as well as the financial support. And here that is where the bottleneck lies, that need a kind of integrated policies that should be evolved.
Yes, very briefly, if you allow me. 2 points. So one point is, in general, since COVID and also the war in Ukraine, in Europe we realized that we really need to avoid becoming dependent on one part of the world. So it's now a real priority to diversify our supply chain also in the area of energy. So that's, it's also relevant for the elements you need for batteries, the solar panels, and also now there will be an issue with electrolyzers. Where do we get the electrolyzers from? So that's one thing I want to mention. The other thing is, and that's again part of this European Green Deal, we're also very keen on keeping the minerals that we have imported, to keep them in Europe, and therefore we need a circular economy. So dealing wiser with the minerals is a very important part of our strategy. Thank you.
I think I think that's a very good point, and I mean I'm very glad you raised the issue of rare minerals, and that this is something we have to ensure that in the name of transitioning from fossil fuels, we don't lead to a situation where it becomes becomes an opportunity to exploit other minerals in the name of just transition. So, for instance, in Malaysia, they're looking at taking off restrictions on protected areas where the rare earth minerals are, and allow them to be extracted in the name of climate change. So we don't want this perverse approach to be taken in the name of addressing climate change, where you go and, then gives a sort of open signal for extraction and mining. Oh, because we are doing it in the name and taking out, using land grabs, taking land away from indigenous people, etc. And also there are already groups working on just mineral transition in countries in Southeast Asia, actually.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ganesh from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Thank you for a wonderful panel. Just a very quick question. So something that came up in the inaugural session also is that the cost of transitioning is something that's being driven by having to foot a heavy bill when it comes to technological innovations, right? From the COVID example, we saw that intellectual property was a major issue in sharing new tech. In that case, it was vaccines, but I'm guessing when it comes to energy transitions, it's going to also be about technological innovations. Now, we see that with the JET IP in South Africa, the tech transfer is also a part of the deal as a grant. Is there a potential for JETPs to push for a rules-based architecture to ensure that that there is intellectual property sharing in a way that enables developing countries in the global south to access technological innovations that are happening, for instance, in the European Union?
Anyone wants to take up the question? Edwin, you would?
Yeah, to be frank, I'm not a real expert on intellectual property rights, and so, but just to say that with India, we recently have agreed to set up a trade and technology council, which is the second one that we have. The first one is with the United States, and there we will discuss, I guess, also this issue. Although I'm not sure. In general, I think there is a problem for governments because governments don't own intellectual property rights. It's the companies that own them. What we try to do as EU in India is connecting European and Indian companies, European and Indian researchers, European and Indian projects, and thereby sharing technology and knowledge. I know this is not a proper answer to the question on intellectual property rights, but we are trying to ensure technology transfer by bringing European and Indian companies together and the researchers and the different research programs. Thank you.
I think it is a good question, but it's a complex and particularly, as mentioned by Edwin, and this technologies lies with the business sector and so the copyright, and also some of these copyright issues cannot be transferred because this technologies evolved in a modular fashion, and so if you are selling one advanced technologies, and then it has the kind of copyright issues with these original technologies. So it is a complex story, and here this developing countries should not have a kind of unrealistic ambition, that is the technology will flow freely from these advanced economies to the developing countries. One way is look into the future of the technologies where the joint R&D and a kind of a partnership could be evolved. And the second thing is who is going to finance it, and that is another critical aspect. We need to discuss it. Thank you.
Since we are really out of time, if it's a very, very short, because we are just out of time. And
thank you so much. I'm Malini Chakravarti from Climate Policy Initiative. I had just a very short question, which is that when we are talking about the just aspect of just transition, that may not come with returns, the kind that one looks for when it comes to financial institutions. So what is the role of public finance in this? If you could speak a little bit on that. Thank you.
So I think that's exactly the point that we are making in South Africa. So thank you for strengthening it. That they, if one looks at common but differentiated responsibility, I stand with the youth, actually. It is urgent. I mean, let us just look at each other in the eye in this room as human beings, and every single person here is clever enough to know that it is really urgent, that we act very fast, and that we, it is going to take everybody in every sector, in every country, doing everything possible to avoid 1.5. So for me, the common but differentiated responsibility part comes in, let's not have chaotic transitions imposed on us. Let us manage our transitions according to the respective circumstances of every country. And secondly, move as fast as you can, but who must pay for it is those who which hold historical responsibility. And that's the grant part. The grant part is when you are standing up for your historical responsibility in getting us to where we are and funding the justice elements. But let us not think, that we can go slower, we can go on for years. We can't. Urgent action is really needed now. That's on the basis of the science. Thanks. By all of us.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you very much. I'll wrap up with a few points, I think, which will lead us to all the next sessions that we have post-lunch today. There are issues of now what national governments needs to allude to and what will be the role of states, which has really come up from this panel, which will take forward in discussions. One of the issues is of just transition, definitely energy security, but what has clearly come out is that energy security concerns should not be a limiting factor. And that's the reason we can remain hopeful that what has been unfolding in the global north with respect to Ukraine war or the Alaskan oil and gas exploration, the net zero targets will stay and will be met. The second issue which has come out very well is, of course, that climate action can go on with our aspirations for economic growth. Just how we plan that economic growth and how we do it will matter. And we also actually talked about circular economy, which is a very important component of just transition now, which is emerging. The third issue that also has come up is the importance of local engagement. And that has been one of the limiting factors of investments planned, such as in South Africa or many other countries. So how do we strengthen local engagement? And subnational actors will have a huge role to play in that. And definitely, I would say there are pragmatic recommendations that has come out, which I hope by the end of this presidency will have some guidelines that can go out to strengthen the partnership and action of countries on just transition. And I leave to that, again, a little gift from my forest to all of our esteemed guests. And thank you.
Suti, while the gifts are coming out, I'm sorry, there is one thing I want to say about all these JETPs. I think that the developing countries should get together sooner rather than later and discuss minimum criteria and requirements for these JETPs. Otherwise, we are going to be caught in situations where we are competing against each other for a race to the bottom in the face of, quite powerful countries who want to come to the party with us.